Welcome back to Reading Bear. Today, we will take a look at some new revenge stories. And if you enjoyed my content, please don't forget to subscribe to my channel and post some bear emojis in the comments. Let's go!
The first one is titled, My Grandmother Put Greedy Preachers in Their Places. Twice. Even after she passed away. My grandmother was a member of a large conservative Bible-believing church for her entire adult life. This church, which I'll call BigWhiteChurch, was a member of a large evangelical denomination. BigWhiteChurch was located in a prosperous suburb of a large city in the Bible Belt of the deep south of the USA. Grandma was very active in BigWhiteChurch. She worked in the nursery every Sunday morning, helped cook hundreds of church fellowship breakfasts and dinners, accompanied her children and grandchildren on dozens of church retreats and choir tours, taught youth Bible study on Sunday nights and was very active in supporting home missions, as well as helping with other youth programs. She always tithed, and often gave extra for missions and special offerings. Grandma's greatest talent was making other people feel important. I've seen this firsthand many times. Although I belonged to a different church, I often visited with Grandma, and when I did, I usually went to BigWhiteChurch functions with her. I've seen her single-handedly cook breakfast for dozens of BigWhiteChurch youth, a task which took over 2 hours, even in the church's large kitchen. Then, after the meal, she asked the group for a round of applause for the high school student leader for doing such a great job of organizing the prayer breakfast. I remember that, on a BigWhiteChurch youth retreat at a rural church camp, she drove most of the night to go back to the city and retrieve a big box of evangelistic materials that one of the assistant pastors, whom I'll call a pastor, had forgotten and asked her to get, in time for our morning program the next day. His boss, the senior pastor, I'll call him Pompous Pastor, never found out that a pastor had screwed up or that Grandma had fixed it for him. A pastor never even thanked Grandma. Even though I was a child, this bothered me so much that I asked her about it. She said that she didn't mind at all. She told me her reward would be that those materials would help children find Jesus. Grandma's service to her church ended abruptly at the age of 73, when she broke her back in a car accident. Afterwards, for the last 10 years of her life, she was homebound and could not go to church because of this injury and declining health due to old age. Her mind was just as sharp as ever, and her faith remained sincere, but her body wore out a little more every day. During those 10 years, she made many efforts to reach out to her church, its leadership and her church friends, inviting them to visit her at her home, etc., without success. Every one of these invitations was declined or simply ignored. Near the end, when she was in home hospice care, she decided to plan her own funeral. She and my grandpa called her church and asked for the senior pastor, Pompous Pastor, whom she had known for over 30 years, to visit her so that they could plan her memorial service, which she and grandpa wanted to be held at the church. Pompous Pastor was too busy, but a pastor stopped by a few days later. According to my grandpa, here's what happened at that meeting. With my grandma literally on her deathbed, Grandma, Grandpa and a pastor discussed her funeral for a couple of minutes. Then a pastor started pressuring her to lay up your treasure in heaven by remembering your church in your will. Grandpa told him firmly that this is neither the time nor the place to discuss her will. They went back to discussing the funeral for a few minutes. Then a pastor steered the conversation back to Grandma's will, with liberal injections of how badly her church needed her support. Grandpa told him several times that it was inappropriate to talk to Grandma about her will or the church's financial needs, because she was terminally ill and in an enormous amount of physical pain. A pastor would agree and briefly talk about the funeral, but would then go back to talking about the church's financial needs, heavenly rewards, where your treasure is your heart will be also, Matthew chapter 6 verse 21, Luke chapter 12 verse 34, etc. My grandma started crying. To put this into context, Grandma was more than a steel magnolia. She was titanium coated with diamond wrapped in Kevlar. She rarely ever cried, and never ever cried about herself. Not one tear when the doctor told her that her back was broken so badly that she would never walk again, nor during the following 6 months in futile rehab. She would shed sincere but well-managed tears at funerals and while visiting family members in the hospital when they received bad news. She would cry to console others, weep with those who weep. But nobody, not Grandpa, not her daughter, my mum, nor any of my uncles or Grandma's siblings, ever remembered her crying for herself. My grandma was sobbing uncontrollably. Grandpa, a retired steelworker, ex-Marine sergeant and Korean War combat veteran, physically grabbed a pastor and escorted him out of their house, not too gently. Contrary to everyone's expectations, Grandma lived another 6 months, mostly because of sheer force of will. Eventually, though, Grandma passed away and we held her memorial service at the funeral home, not Big White Church. Pompous pastor and a pastor were conspicuously absent. In fact, there were no professional Christians from Big White Church at the service at all, not even in the audience. To start the service, Grandpa stood up at the podium in front of the crowd and said, "Some of you may have heard that I disinvited pompous pastor and a pastor from this funeral service. This service is not an appropriate place for me to give you my reasons for doing this, although you all know me and so you know that my reasons are good ones. Also, my wife asked me to exclude them. This funeral service may be different from other funerals that you have attended. It is going to be an open microphone funeral. Everyone who wants to say something is invited to come up here and describe your friendship with my wife, tell a story about her that is worth remembering or anything else that you want to say that will honor her memory and bring comfort to everyone here today. I have asked several family members to prepare statements, but you don't have to have anything prepared. Please, if you want to say something, come up here and do so." There were about 100 people at the funeral service. At least a third of them eventually stepped up to the microphone. The service, which we had planned to last about 30 minutes, lasted for over 2 hours and, as best I can tell, not one person left early. There was laughing, crying and hugging. 3 of her grandchildren played some of her favorite songs on the piano and guitar. We all joined hands and sang her favorite hymns. Afterwards, dozens of people told my grandpa that it was one of the most comforting and uplifting funerals they had ever attended. More than a few remarked that funerals are better without preachers anyway, or something similar. Remembering her pastors and her church in her will, the 1-2 punch a couple of weeks later, it was time to start distributing the bequests in Grandma's will. Although Grandma and Grandpa dearly loved each other, they had separate wills because, she told my mum, that makes it easier for us to respect each other's turf, and because their lawyer had recommended it. Nobody thought that my grandparents were wealthy. They had lived in the same small but charming house in a prosperous, well-maintained suburban neighborhood for the past 50+ years, and had worked hard and lived modestly. But it was rumored that they had a very nice nest egg. Of course, there is no legal requirement for anyone to attend the reading of the will, or to even have a reading. Modern telecommunications and near-universal literacy have made this quaint custom practically extinct. But the reading of the will was a tradition in our family because it was one of those events that gave our close-knit, extended family an excuse to get together. We never had family reunions. They were too difficult to schedule for our large family. But we got together at birthdays, holidays, funerals, baptisms, etc., so that if you attended several of these, you would see just about every one of your cousins, aunts, uncles, and even great-aunts and uncles who were grandmas and grandpas' siblings and in-laws. With this family tradition in mind, many of our family members' wills often contain very personal bequests of items that had little cash value, but were the departed family members' way of telling their loved ones that they wanted to share a cherished memory with them one last time. As an added incentive to attend, the family rumor mill had been buzzing with speculation, encouraged by Grandpa, that grandmas will contain some surprises. The reading was held in a conference room at a lawyer's office. Unsurprisingly, the attendees included my mum, as well as aunts, uncles, great-aunts, great-uncles and many of the grandchildren. We were all surprised, however, to see pompous pastor and a pastor from Big White Church. They informed us that Grandma's lawyer had told them that grandmas will had bequests not only for Big White Church, but also for them personally. Maybe it was just our imagination, but my siblings, cousins and I couldn't help noticing that these preachers appeared to be actively salivating over their good fortune at Grandma's generosity. Grandma had a large family, so a sizable number of beneficiaries were named in her will. The lawyer's conference room was a bit smaller than an average middle-class living room. Extra chairs had been brought in, every seat was filled and people were standing in every remaining space. There was barely space for all of us. Grandma's lawyer suggested that pompous pastor and a pastor sit in chairs which were in the front of the room, next to himself. Since there was a large table in the room, this meant that the lawyer and these 2 preachers were the only ones who were directly facing everyone else. Although the preachers were gratified to be physically next to the center of attention, they did not notice, as all of the rest of us quickly noticed, that these seats made it easy for everyone else in the room to watch them closely, and practically impossible for them to leave the packed to more than overflowing room before the entire meeting was over. Because they were farthest from the room's single door, and there were almost 24 people standing or sitting between them and their only path to escape. The bequests were quite generous, but pretty much what we had expected. Grandpa kept their house, its contents, their retirement accounts and everything that remained after all of the bequests had been satisfied. Children, grandchildren and several local charities received nice, but not extravagant, amounts of money. Several sentimental items were named and given to various friends and relatives. Grandpa was first beneficiary listed in the will. But, after him, all of the other bequests were arranged in order of increasing worth. They started with sentimental items, which had very small cash value. Then each grandchild received several $1,000s, then each son, daughter, brother, sister, niece and nephew received a little more, then several local non-profits received very nice amounts, etc. Bequests to BigWhiteChurch, pompous pastor and a pastor were almost the last ones listed in the will. They listened politely to the other bequests, but with steadily growing anticipation, as they noticed the exponential upward trend in Grandma's largesse. When Grandma's lawyer got to the BigWhiteChurch and preacher's part of the will, he said, "This is a bit unusual, but before I announce these bequests to BigWhiteChurch, pompous pastor and a pastor, Ms. Grandma's name, requested that I read the following statement to everyone present." He opened a letter that was written in Grandma's own handwriting. "For the past 10 years, not one person from BigWhiteChurch has ever called me, come to visit me or sent me a note to tell me that they cared about me. Not one minister, not one deacon, not one of the church women, not one of the church members who I worked with for all of those years, loved dearly and thought were my friends. I worked very hard for you when you needed me, for many, many years. But when I needed you and your church, you all pretended that I didn't exist. I only got one visit. When I was dying and I invited pompous pastor to come to my house and help me plan my funeral. This was my last attempt, after many attempts that I had made over the past 10 years, to reach out to my church and pastor, whom I still loved dearly even though they had made it clear that they did not love me. If only I could have my funeral at my church, maybe some of my church friends, whom I had not seen in a decade, would come to the service to see me one last time. And I know they loved to hear pompous pastor preach, so if he preached at my funeral, maybe they would come to my funeral to hear him, even if they would not have come to see me. But pompous pastor couldn't find the time to visit me, or even call me to tell me whether or not he was willing to preach at my funeral. A pastor came by my house, but he didn't want to talk about my funeral. He just wanted me to remember his church in my will. That's all. Just remember his church in my will. It was then that I realized that I had allowed my church to break my heart for one last time. But that was the last time. The very last time. A pastor did not know it when he visited me, but Grandpa and I had already prepared my will, long before his visit, which did include a double tithe, 20%, of my entire estate, for what was now my former church. BigWhiteChurch. This amount was named the amount, an enormous shitload of money, generating muffled wows from many of her heirs, including me. But I got to feeling badly that we had not personally remembered such nice people as pompous pastor and a pastor. So I changed my will to include them by name. While I was at it, I changed the amount of money that I left to BigWhiteChurch to match all of the love that they have showed to me during the last 10 years of my life, when I was suffering and lonely, and no longer able to work my butt off for them, for free, like I had done for almost half a century. That is her entire written statement, the lawyer said. Now let's get back to the bequests in the will. Bequest to a pastor, 1 cent. Bequest to pompous pastor, 1 cent. Bequest to BigWhiteChurch, 1 cent. The pompous pastor and a pastor sat there looking like someone had just injected a gallon of Novocaine into their jaws. Every one of Grandma's family and friends felt an overwhelming urge to laugh out loud. But we kept quiet because we knew Grandma. We knew she wasn't finished yet. Grandma was simply setting them up for a 1-2 punch. The best was yet to come, and we didn't want to miss it. There is one last bequest, the lawyer continued, for a charity called, which he named and I'll call, Black Charity, then he paused before naming the amount. Most of us had no idea what Black Charity was. But by the looks on their faces, we could tell that pompous pastor and a pastor knew Black Charity very well. Their faces displayed the same expressions of shock, dread and horror that they would have if the lawyer had said, "This bequest goes to the demonic baby eaters to buy extra large rotisserie barbecue grills and tons of charcoal." Every eye in the room was now fixated on pompous pastor and a pastor. The lawyer, who happened to be my uncle, one of Grandma's and Grandpa's sons, let the silence continue a few seconds more. If we had been able to read pompous pastors and a pastor's minds, we would have known the history behind the looks on their faces. Black Charity was sponsored by a large black church just a few miles from BigWhiteChurch. They ran a free food, clothing bank, assistance programs for foster children, home delivery of pre-cooked meals for homebound seniors, legal aid, and other social services. A long time ago, BigWhiteChurch, which was, and still is, 100% Caucasian, had provided a few years of financial and other support to Black Charity. Then there was a very bitter, acrimonious breakup, allegedly because Black Charity was practicing the social gospel, while BigWhiteChurch was preaching the true gospel. BigWhiteChurch even sued to try to get some of their money back, although the suit was eventually settled and very little money actually changed hands. But this being the Deep South, everyone knew the real reason why BigWhiteChurch, or any white church, would stop supporting a black charity. Those were getting uppity and not staying in their place. Grandma and Grandpa had seriously considered leaving BigWhiteChurch at that time. But they had reasoned that it was better to stay there and teach tolerance by their words and example. They knew they would never persuade everyone, but maybe they could reach some of the youth at their white church and break the generational cycle of racism. Grandma used to tell us, "My church is my mission field." We did not learn the true depth of her statement until after she died. Since then, Grandma and Grandpa had secretly sent a portion of their tithe to Black Charity every month. Most of Grandma's family, including me, didn't find out about any of this until after the meeting had ended. But pompous pastor and a pastor obviously understood what Grandma, by her actions which are more powerful than words, was saying to them. If you had grown up as a white person in the Deep South, as Grandma, Grandpa, pompous pastor and a pastor had, you would understand. To many white Southerners, this was one of the most personally insulting things you could do to them. It simultaneously labeled them as racists, condemned their bigotry and crushed their delusions of white superiority by saying, "These black human beings, whom you hate, disrespect and have mistreated, are better people than you are. So they deserve my money more than you do." Having allowed time for everyone to observe pompous pastor and a pastor while they thought about how their white church had treated this black charity, and how they and their church had treated our grandma. The lawyer said, "The amount is." Then he named the exact same amount that Grandma had named in her handwritten letter, the huge amount of money that would have gone to BigWhiteChurch if she had not changed her will. The last one is titled, "Your bad driving caused you to not get hired." Background: I work for a construction company that has many divisions, but I work in the new construction section. I've been working at this company for about 5 years, but actually worked along with my dad, who had 30+ years at the same company. Because of his long tenure in not only the field but with the company, I got a lot of inside perks. I created a lot of very beneficial professional relationships through him. My dad recently became very sick, suffering from liver and throat cancer stage 4, and had to stop coming to work. My dad and I were the only office guys in the department, so once he stepped away I became #1 guy in the department, making all the decisions. This detail will come into play later. The crime: I recently got engaged to the woman of my dreams. We had planned on getting married in 2018, but with my dad being sick and not sure how long he will have, we moved it up to fall of 2017. So we are getting all of the wedding planning stuff done as soon as possible. This last weekend, February 11th 12th, we conquered a lot of the list. The incident happened on the 11th. We had just finished our registry and about to meet our DJ at a local coffee shop, but had some time for lunch. We grabbed a quick meal before he headed to our meeting. As I'm pulling up to the stop sign to leave the parking lot into the street, a car pulls in tight and cuts me off a good 10 feet before the stop sign off of the street. Now, usually I have horrible road rage. Fingers, cuss words, and sometimes I've thrown crap from my car in fits of rage. My fiancée hates my road rage and I try to behave myself as much as possible when she is in the car. So when this guy cut me off, all I did was throw up my hands in the air in a "what the hell" gesture. He was driving a Chrysler 300 and had Illinois plates. I'll get some hate comments for this next comment, I'm sure. I can't stand Illinois drivers. A lot of those idiots from the rich Chicago suburbs come to my town for school and they drive like buttholes. As I threw up my hands, he slammed on his brakes and looked at me. Rolled down his window and asked, "What's your deal?" I respond with, "You cut me off. Don't know how to take turns very well?" He's responded with, "Want to get out of the car?" Yes. At this point that is all my head is screaming, but when he asked this my fiancée grabbed my arm and said, "Please don't." So I looked at him and said, "No, I don't want to get out of the car, I want you to learn how to drive." His response was to call me a pussy for listening to my witch and drive off. He hit all of my buttons in the matter of a minute. Bad driving, not apologizing, and disrespecting one of my loved ones. If she wasn't there in the car, there would have been a fight. I thought that was the end of me seeing that butthead and I was not happy. Karma was on my side. The revenge, since my dad has left work, my responsibilities have doubled and that caused me to stay later and even come in on weekends. My boss, seeing my struggle, asked if he could hire someone to help take some of the load off of my desk. Since my dad leaving, I've pushed to have one of the field guys take over because they already know a lot about what's going on and wouldn't have to teach much to them. My boss didn't like that idea because he didn't want to lose one of our great field guys. He put some ads out to hire someone, but promised me I would be part of the hiring process and would even have the last word with hiring since I would be working them a lot. Like Santa bringing you everything you asked for on Christmas morning, that butthead that cut me off walks through the front door asking about the opening. He hadn't seen me yet, and being in the company car when I drive to and from work, he didn't see my car either. My boss took him to the conference room and asked the basic questions while I was finishing a bid we wanted to send out. Then came my chance. My boss called me on the speakerphone asking me to come back to finish the interview. I usually hate Mondays, but this felt like the greatest Monday I could ever have. Right when I walked in that room, the butthat's eyes lit up and got real big. What made it even better is as I'm walking in, I hear my boss tell him that I'm coming to finish the interview and would be his boss, and we wanted to make sure it was a good fit. The interview went poorly, like really poorly. I barely roasted him with any difficult questions because he was so nervous, freaked out that his answers to my questions were horrible. My boss then took me out the hallway after I was done and asked what I thought. I told him the whole situation and said I could never work with him. That was all my boss needed and said we will keep looking for a new replacement. Best part is I got to tell the guy the news. I basically told him to get the hell out and laughed at his face about trying to get a job here. Funniest part actually, is he told me he already had other job offers at some of my competitors and was just shopping around. Idiot actually named the competitors who he claimed had offered him jobs. What he didn't know, is that our company is actually really close and friendly with our competitors. I called up those companies and told them what happened, and they not only told me they did not offer him jobs but now they definitely won't. Thanks for listening.